With us now, MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin, outside the courthouse in Lower Manhattan, and NBC News correspondent Dasha Burns, who was at Trump Tower. Also with us, David Marcus, a criminal defense attorney and a professor at the University of Miami School of Law, and Glenn Kirshner, a former federal prosecutor and host of the Justice Matters podcast. He is also an MSNBC legal analyst. So, Lisa, you were inside that courtroom. What'd you see?
Jose, I saw what I would call a pleasant argument in some ways, and three judges on the panel who had a number of questions for both sides, but not so many questions that either side was allowed to go over their time. And as Glenn and David can tell you, when appellate judges are really interested in resolving things that are still stuck in their head, it's not atypical for an argument to run over time. Here, on the other hand, they stuck very, very closely to the 20 minutes, and that's because, in my view, they were dubious of the arguments that former President Trump is making to try and overturn the first of these E. Jean Carroll verdicts. His argument is principally that Judge Lou Kaplan of the federal courthouse to my right over here at that first trial inappropriately admitted evidence of three kinds. Two being testimony from women who accused former President Trump of sexually assaulting them. One in an incident dating back to the 1970s, one dating back to the 1990s. And of course, former President Trump also is contesting the admission of that Access Hollywood tape, which E. Jean Carroll's lawyers saying now wasn't used to show his propensity to commit sexual assault, but rather should be understood as his confession that he routinely did things like he did to E. Jean Carroll and those two other witnesses, Jose.
And so, Lisa, what effect, or could it have an effect, what is decided in this case on the other case filed by E. Jean Carroll?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because that's the reason I think Donald Trump showed up in court this morning. It's not just about this first trial where E. Jean Carroll won damages in the amount of roughly $5 million. It's because Judge Kaplan, after the first verdict where a jury found him liable for defamation and sexual assault, held that in the second trial, former President Trump was not allowed to contest those findings. Rather, he was bound by the first finding that he had sexually assaulted her and that he defamed her. And therefore, the second trial was just about the quantum of damages that he would owe her. You and I both know that former President Trump at that second trial was found liable for over $83 million to E. Jean Carroll. So with $88.3 million on the line and counting, because it's accruing interest, former President Trump is definitely concerned about the impact on his wallet, as well as the reputational damage with female voters stemming from this case, Jose.
And Dasha, do we know about why Trump decided to attend today's arguments when he didn't have to attend? I mean, he didn't attend much of the original trial.
Yeah, it is voluntary. To Lisa's point, yes, it's about the money piece of it, and it's also about the element of optics and of defiance and of trying to dispel the painting that Harris is trying to paint of the prosecutor versus the felon versus the sexual abuser. So he's showing up, trying to own this court appearance. You'll remember, while he didn't show up for the first Carroll case, he did show up in the second one. He felt like his presence was important. He wants to stand there. He wants to stare down that panel of judges. And he's showing up here in front of us, in front of the press today to talk about this and hopefully to answer some of our questions, Jose.
And so, David, talk to us a little bit about what exactly happened today. What was the reason behind it? And what is the importance of this three-judge panel?
Well, typically, Jose, you know, trials have the drama, not appellate arguments. But today was drama in the appellate court because, as you say, Trump showed up, which typically does not happen on an appeal. And an appeal, you know, typically is academic. There's questions of legal arguments. But both sides started out today wanting to talk about the facts, wanting to get into what happened at the trial, and Trump being there added so much drama to the whole thing. So unlike most appellate arguments, we had that high drama today.
And so Glenn and Lisa was bringing up that the defense was bringing up issues about those three different kind of pillars of that initial trial, where, you know, including testimony by some people in other time periods. What do you make of that argument?
Yeah, you know, I think I agree with Lisa that it seemed like the judges were dubious at best at some of what John Sauer, Donald Trump's appellate counsel, was arguing. You know, his opening salvo sure sounded like he was playing to somebody sitting out in the audience and not the three-judge panel, because what Sauer did was he started to attack the evidence in pretty inflammatory terms. This is the kind of stuff you usually don't hear in appellate arguments. And very quickly, one of the judges cut him off and said, and I quote, "It is very hard to overturn a jury verdict based on evidentiary issues. Why should we order a new trial?" So I think it's, first of all, pretty unusual for a defendant or a respondent in a civil case not to be bothered attending his own trial, but then showing up in appellate court, which is rare. But I agree with Lisa's assessment. John Sauer and Donald Trump's arguments did not seem to get much play.
And so, David, what does Trump and his team need to prove to get this overturned?
Sure. And just to be fair, I mean, Roberta Kaplan, who was arguing for the plaintiff, also started out with the facts, and the judges moved her to the legal arguments. But Trump has to show, A, that mistakes were made at the trial, but that's not enough. He has to show that the mistakes were so egregious, that they were so impactful, that they were not harmless on the jury, that they affected the jury's decision. And that's the tricky part. I think he's going to be able to show that mistakes were made, that some of this evidence should not have come in, what they call propensity evidence or other bad act evidence should not have come in. The tricky part for him is going to be to show that it was so egregious that it impacted the jury's verdict. Now, from his,
how do you prove that, or how do you even bring that question up?
It's so hard, and it's the bane of every appellate lawyer's existence to try to prove that it affected the jury's verdict. Because exactly, how do you do that? How do you get back into the jury's mind and say they would have come out differently had they not heard this evidence that they shouldn't have heard? And the standard is, do you have confidence in the verdict if you take that evidence out? And Trump has an argument here that you would lose confidence if you took that propensity evidence out. That's Trump's main argument here.
And Lisa, when can we expect to get a decision from the appeals court?
Jose, it's anybody's guess. The Second Circuit works according to its own timing. We could see a decision from this panel as soon as a few weeks from now, or it may take several months. Sometimes appellate court decisions can even take upwards of a year or two, as we saw in the D.C. Circuit with respect to some of those civil cases brought by former Capitol police officers against former President Trump. That Blasingame decision that we've talked about took almost 2 years between the time of oral argument and when that decision was rendered. Hopefully it will be less than that, Jose.
And Dasha, what are we expecting to hear from Trump next hour?
Well, it's a great question. The campaign has been a little bit cagey about the focus of this press conference. We have heard that he'll be talking about court. We've heard that he'll be talking about the issues on the Democratic side of the aisle. But I know a lot of us here are very curious to ask about some of the policy proposals that he's made in recent days, whether that be on IVF, his economic proposals that he laid out yesterday here in New York, and so much more that is likely to take center stage at the debate next week.